Electroshock social experiment on children. In the 1960s, Dr. Bender of New York's Creedmoor Hospital began what she believed to be a revolutionary treatment for children with social issues. Bender's methods included interviewing and analyzing a sensitive child in front of a large group, then applying a gentle amount of electric shock pressure to the child's head. Supposedly, any child who moved with the pressure was showing early signs of schizophrenia. She was herself a victim of a misunderstood childhood, but Bender was said to be unsympathetic to the children in her care. By the time her treatments were shut down, Bender had used electroshock therapy on over 100 children, the youngest of whom was age 3. Malaria experiment on inmates. During World War II, malaria and other tropical diseases were impeding the efforts of the American military in the Pacific. In order to get a grip, the Malaria Research Project was established at Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois. Doctors from the University of Chicago exposed 441 volunteer inmates to bites from malaria-infected mosquitoes. Even though one inmate died of a heart attack, researchers insisted his death was unrelated to the study. The widely praised experiment continued at Stateville for 29 years and included the first human test of primaquine, a medication still used in the treatment of malaria and pneumonia. Hepatitis experiment on mentally ill children. In the 1950s, Willowbrook State School, a New York state-run institution for mentally handicapped children, began experiencing outbreaks of hepatitis. Due to unsanitary conditions, it was virtually inevitable that these children would contract hepatitis. Dr. Saul Krugman was sent to investigate the outbreak and proposed an experiment that would assist in developing a vaccine. However, the experiment required deliberately infecting children with the disease. Although Krugman's study was controversial from the start, critics were eventually silenced by the permission letters obtained from each child's parents. In reality, offering one's child to the experiment was often the only way to guarantee admission into the overcrowded institution. The speech experiment. In 1939, university researchers Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor conducted a stuttering experiment on 22 orphan children in Davenport, Iowa. The children were separated into two groups, the first of which received positive speech therapy where children were praised for speech fluency. In the second group, children received negative speech therapy and were belittled for every speech imperfection. Normal-speaking children in the second group developed speech problems which they then retained for the rest of their lives. Terrified by the news of human experiments conducted by the Nazis, Johnson and Tudor never published the results of their study. The drugs experiment. Initially established in the 1950s as a sub-project of a CIA-sponsored mind control research program, Operation Midnight Climax sought to study the effects of LSD on individuals. In San Francisco and New York, unconsenting subjects were lured to safehouses by prostitutes on the CIA payroll, unknowingly given LSD and other mind-altering substances, and monitored from behind one-way mirror glass. At sufficiently high dosages, LSD manifests primarily in visual, as well as hallucinations. Though the safe houses were shut down in 1965, when it was discovered that the CIA was administering LSD to human subjects, the CIA claimed Operation Midnight Climax was a theater for extensive research on sexual blackmail and surveillance technology. San Quentin experiments on inmates. One benefit of being an inmate at California's San Quentin prison was the easy access to acclaimed Bay Area doctors. But if that's the case, then a downside is that these doctors also had easy access to inmates. From 1913 to 1951, Dr. Leo Stanley, chief surgeon at San Quentin, used prisoners as test subjects in a variety of bizarre medical experiments. Stanley's experiments included sterilization and potential treatments for the Spanish flu. In one particularly disturbing experiment, Stanley performed testicle transplants on living prisoners using testicles from executed prisoners, and in some cases, from goats and boars. The blood pressure experiment. In the 1960s, researchers at the University of California began an experiment to study changes in blood pressure and blood flow. The researchers used 113 newborns ranging in age from 1 hour to 3 days old as test subjects. In one experiment, a catheter was inserted through the umbilical arteries and into the aorta. The newborn's feet were then immersed in ice water for the purpose of testing aortic pressure. In another experiment, up to 50 newborns were individually strapped onto a circumcision board, then tilted so that their blood rushed to their head and their blood pressure could be monitored. From 1946 to 1948, the United States government, Guatemalan President Juan José, and some health ministries cooperated in a disturbing human experiment on unwitting citizens. Doctors deliberately infected soldiers, prostitutes, prisoners, and mental patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases in an attempt to track their untreated natural progression. Syphilis is a bacterial infection usually spread by sexual contact. The disease starts as a painless sore, typically on the genitals, rectum, or mouth. Treated only with antibiotics, the experiment resulted in at least 30 documented deaths. In 2010, the United States made a formal apology to Guatemala for their involvement in these experiments. The radioactive iron experiment on babies. Shortly after World War II, with the impending Cold War forefront on the minds of Americans, many medical researchers were preoccupied with the idea of radioactivity and chemical warfare. In an experiment at Vanderbilt University, 829 pregnant women were given vitamin drinks, which they were told would improve the health of their unborn babies. Instead, the drinks contained radioactive iron, and the researchers were studying how quickly the radioisotope crossed into the placenta. At least 7 of the babies later died from cancers and leukemia, and the women themselves experienced rashes, bruises, anemia, loss of hair and tooth, and cancer. In 1956 and 1957, the United States Army conducted biological warfare experiments on the cities of Georgia and Florida. In one such experiment, millions of infected mosquitoes were released into the 2 cities, in order to see if the insects could spread yellow fever and dengue fever. Hundreds of researchers contracted illnesses that included fevers, respiratory problems, stillbirths, and typhoid. This led to several people's deaths as a result of the research. In order to photograph the results of their experiments, Army researchers pretended to be public health workers. The chemical warfare experiment. From 1937 to 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army developed a biological and chemical warfare research experiment facility. Based in the large city of Harbin, Unit 731 was responsible for some of the most atrocious war crimes. Chinese and Russian citizens were subjected to experiments that included the removal of organs from a live body. Some prisoners even had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to the intestines. Many of the scientists involved in Unit 731 rose to prominent careers in politics and medicine.